Thomas Mitchell had always been a man of routine. Every morning at 7:15, he would emerge from his modest apartment on Maple Street, briefcase in hand, and walk the exact same route to the downtown law office, where he worked as a paralegal. His neighbors knew him as quiet, reliable, and utterly unremarkable, which is precisely why no one suspected that Thomas Mitchell was methodically planning to vanish from the face of the earth. It began 3 months earlier, on a Tuesday that started like any other. Thomas was organizing case files when Detective Rodriguez knocked on his door at home that evening. The detective's questions were routine at first about Thomas's whereabouts the previous weekend, about his relationship with Sarah Chin, a local journalist who had been found dead in her apartment. Thomas answered truthfully. He barely knew Sarah, had met her only once at a coffee shop where she had interviewed him about a minor legal case he was assisting with. But as the investigation progressed, the questions became more pointed. Sarah's laptop contained Thomas's contact information. A witness claimed to have seen someone matching his description near her building the night she died. Security footage from a nearby store showed a man in a coat similar to one Thomas owned. None of it was conclusive, but Thomas could see the web of circumstantial evidence slowly tightening around him. The turning point came during his third police interview. Detective Rodriguez leaned back in his chair and said, "Thomas, we both know you were there that night. Sarah had discovered something about the Henderson case you were working on, hadn't she? Something that could ruin your career, maybe even land you in prison. So you silenced her." Thomas's blood ran cold. The Henderson case was a routine insurance fraud investigation, nothing more. But he could see in Rodriguez's eyes that the detective had already decided on his guilt. Investigation had stalled, and Thomas had become a convenient target. An innocent man was about to be framed for murder. That night, Thomas sat in his apartment and faced a terrible reality. He could fight the charges, hire a lawyer, and hope the justice system would protect him. But he had seen too many cases go wrong, too many innocent people convicted on circumstantial evidence. The real killer was still out there, and the police had stopped looking for anyone else. So Thomas made a decision that would have seemed impossible to him just weeks earlier. He would disappear. The planning took 2 months. Thomas had certain advantages his legal background had taught him about evidence, about how investigations worked, about the systems that track people in modern society. He began methodically erasing his digital footprint, slowly draining his bank accounts in small amounts, and researching places where someone could start over without leaving a trail. He studied the case of John Darwin, the British man who faked his own death in a canoeing accident and learned from Darwin's mistakes. He researched the identities of deceased children, looking for someone born around the same time as him who had died young, whose identity could be borrowed. He found Michael Torres, who had died in a car accident at age 6 in 1987. With patience and forged documents, Thomas began building a new identity. The most difficult part was the emotional preparation. Thomas had no family left. His parents had died years earlier, but he had friends, colleagues, a life that he would have to abandon forever. He wrote letters to the few people who mattered. To him, letters that would never be sent, explaining his innocence and his reasons for disappearing. Writing those letters was like attending his own funeral. Thomas chose a Friday in November for his disappearance. He left his apartment that morning as usual, but instead of going to work, he drove to a remote section of the Clearwater River, 2 hours from town. He had scouted this location weeks earlier, an area with strong currents and deep pools where a body might never be found. He left his car in the parking area of a hiking trail, keys in the ignition, driver's side door slightly ajar, scattered. Some of his clothes along the riverbank, tore his jacket on a branch, and left a shoe partially buried in the mud near the water's edge. Then he walked 3 miles through the forest to where he had hidden a bicycle the night before. The bicycle took him to a bus station in the next county, where he had left a bag containing his new identity papers, a change of clothes, and enough cash to start over. By the time the police found his car the next morning, Michael Torres was already on a bus heading west, toward a new life. The local news covered his disappearance extensively. "Local man vanishes near River Reed," the headlines. The police organized search parties, dragged the river, and interviewed everyone who knew him, Detective Rodriguez in a press conference. suggested that Thomas had taken his own life rather than face justice for Sarah Chen's murder. The case was quietly closed within 6 months. But Thomas had made one critical miscalculation. 3 weeks after his disappearance, while he was working at a construction site in Arizona under his new identity, the real killer was caught. DNA evidence from another crime scene linked a drifter named Carl Brennan to Sarah Chen's murder. Brennan confessed to killing her during a robbery gone wrong. He had never heard of Thomas Mitchell. The news of Thomas's innocence made national headlines. "Dead man vindicated in murder case," the papers proclaimed. His former colleagues and friends were interviewed, all expressing shock and sadness that an innocent man had apparently taken his own life rather than face false accusations. Thomas saw the news coverage from a bar in Phoenix. He sat there, drink in hand, watching his own vindication on television. He was free to return home to reclaim his life, to resurrect Thomas Mitchell from the dead. But how could he explain his survival? How could he prove he hadn't faked his death without admitting he had faked his death? The man who had planned the perfect disappearance realized he had trapped himself in his own success. He was free, but he could never be free. He was innocent, but he could never prove it. He was alive, but Thomas Mitchell had to remain dead. Years later, a man named Michael Torres would sometimes catch his reflection in a mirror and see a ghost staring back at him. He had saved himself from a false conviction, but in doing so, he had sentenced himself to a different kind of prison. He was the innocent man who had planned his own disappearance so well that he could never reappear. The perfect crime, it turned out, was the one committed against himself. And sometimes, late at night in his small apartment in Phoenix, Thomas Mitchell would wonder if Detective Rodriguez had been right about one thing after all. Perhaps he really had died that day by the river. Perhaps the man who woke up each morning as Michael Torres was just a ghost, haunting a life that could never truly be his own. The innocent man had planned his own disappearance, but he had never planned for the possibility that innocence itself might disappear along with him, leaving behind only the echo of a life that justice had failed to protect and that he had failed to save.